Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, I rise to inform Parliament of Fiji's chairing of the Small States Forum of the World Bank. His role as chair of the 2019 World Bank and IMF, or International Monetary Fund, Board of Governors meetings, and the outcomes of the third Climate Action Pacific Partnership Conference, or CAP3, which was just recently be held at the GPH. Mr. Speaker, sir, building on the success of our global leadership on matters related to climate change over the past 2 years, we've continued our regional leadership on sustainable development and continue to punch above our weight in the international arena to voice the concerns of small island developing states and indeed other states that are facing the brunt of climate change. Never before, Mr. Speaker, sir, our leadership in multilateralism has been regarded so highly. Never before has a small state been able to steer global discourse towards sustainable, inclusive, resilient and low-carbon development with such dexterity. Mr. Speaker, sir, before I inform Parliament about the particulars of Fiji's role as chair of the World Bank and IMF, please let me set the context of the importance for this important international undertaking. The World Bank and the IMF combined are the world's largest public international financial institutions in terms of the dollar value of finance mobilized. The two organizations continue to support global development and economic stability through their policy advice, lending operations, provisions of grants and technical assistance. For small and vulnerable nations, easy access to multilateral financial resources can also be catered for. Mr. Speaker, sir, needless to say that the cost of our development needs far outweigh existing domestic and international finance flows. In other words, there's a huge gap between the financial needs and the finance that's actually available. This is perpetuated by the fact that the cost of accessing mainstream non-concessional development finance has unwanted fiscal impacts. This is where multilateral IFS like World Bank and IMF play crucial roles in shaping the future of developing nations through targeted and flexible concessional development financing. The World Bank has recently announced a funding allocation of US $200 billion from 2021 to 2025. And the IMF is catalyzing important market conversations that are influencing greater access to vulnerability financing. Mr. Speaker, sir, the financial world is fast realizing that climate change is an economic imperative and indeed an opportunity, and Fiji is already placing itself at the heart of this realization in search of innovative grant and concessional financing for climate change, sustainable development, and indeed meeting our adaptation costs. Mr. Speaker, sir, one of the reasons why Fiji is actively taking leadership role opportunities in the global arena to influence the discourse on international financing in favor of national development needs is because we need to be in the play to be able to make our voices heard. Fiji officially assumed its role as chair of the 2019 World Bank and IMF Board of Governors meetings at the spring meetings in April of this year. As chair of this high-level gathering, Fiji was briefed on key matters of discussion in the lead-up to the World Bank and IMF annual meetings in October 2019. And as a matter of interest, Mr. Speaker, sir, the next time Fiji will get to chair IMF and World Bank meetings, I think, will be about 183 years' time, which is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. At the annual meetings, Fiji will have an opportunity to address the plenary session of the Board of Governors, together with the President of the World Bank and IMF Managing Director, creating an unprecedented opportunity to raise issues of national and regional significance at such a high-level forum. Mr. Speaker, sir, as a matter of interest, because of the chairing of the World Bank and IMF, Fiji has also chaired the Joint Committee on Remuneration of Executive Directors and Alternative Executive Directors. The JCR considers and makes recommendations to the Board of Governors of both the Bank and IMF on all matters affecting the remuneration and benefits of the Executive Directors of the Bank and IMF and the Alternate Directors. In 2018, the Board of Governors of the Bank and IMF voted differently for the first time on the JCR's recommendation, departing from the usual practice of parity between the two organizations. As chair of the JCR, Fiji now not only has to review the salaries of the directors for 2019, but also has to provide leadership in formulating a long-term and feasible solution to the determination of directors' remuneration for both IMF and the bank because of the anomaly created in 2018. The next meeting of the JCR, Mr. Speaker, sir, is expected to be held in Singapore in early July. And as a matter of interest, the co-chairs are the former governor of the bank, or the Central Bank of Finland, and a former Minister of Finance from Cote d'Ivoire. Mr. Speaker, sir, Fiji's crowning achievement of the spring meeting was gaining access to financing from the International Development Association, or IDA, which allows Fiji to receive up to US $21 million annually in concessional financing through the World Bank. And I'd like to thank the many partners, including Australia, and I see our friends in Australia in the gallery, who actually provided a lot of support to us to get Fiji across the line. Fiji's eligibility to access this large pool of funding is a result of revisions to World Bank's IDA Small Islands Economies Exception. We've finally been able to get access to IDA funds, which essentially means, Mr. Speaker, sir, that even though Fiji is deemed to be a middle-income country, we can now access IDA funds, which essentially means that the terms and conditions of the loan is a 0% interest with 10 years grace period and a 40 years maturity date of the loan. This is a very long-term loan, and by the time, of course, if it's 0% interest, if you borrow $21 million today, you paid $40 million later. In fact, you're paying less than what you borrowed. This means, of course, Mr. Speaker, sir, that there's also another edge to it, that Fiji can access additional funding for regionally focused development projects in the areas such as fisheries, ICT, climate resilience, maritime and aviation infrastructure investments. There's a potential to not only benefit Fiji, but also neighboring countries across the Pacific. Mr. Speaker, sir, at the IMF World Bank meetings last year, Fiji was elected to become the chair of the Small States Forum within the World Bank group also. The SSF is a group of 50 small states from around the world with a population size of less than 1.5 million coming together. And these states, Mr. Speaker, sir, consist of countries from landlocked countries in Africa to Asia, to the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, and of course the Pacific Ocean, Mr. Speaker, sir. We had, Mr. Speaker, sir, in the spring meetings 120 delegates, including ministers and governors of the World Bank in attendance. Having influence over the agenda of the SSF, Fiji steered in-depth discussions amongst forum members on blue economy and marine pollution, climate change adaptation and resilience, including economic and financial sustainability, some of the matters which the UN Secretary General just referred to in his speech, Mr. Speaker, sir. We also, Mr. Speaker, sir, for the first time under the SSF, agreed to convene a working group under the forum comprising of finance ministers from Maldives, Seychelles, Bhutan, Lesotho, Malta, and from the Organization of the Eastern Caribbean States to provide high-level advisory support for championing issues relevant to small states with the objective of achieving tangible outcomes over the next 2 years. Mr. Speaker, sir, Fiji's position also was enhanced because Fiji is the first ever country to carry out a climate vulnerability assessment, which was also, Mr. Speaker, sir, highlighted, and many of the other small states actually want to emulate what Fiji has done. We also, as the Secretary General of the UN talked about, first emerging economy to issue the green bonds, which we talked about, and of course various issues such as public-private partnerships. And we look forward to securing benefits through the forum and lead the charge for the Small States Forum in this respect, Mr. Speaker, sir. Fiji will continue to, in this respect, advance discussion on achieving priority action items and launch regional projects on oceans and climate change adaptation through greater collaboration with the World Bank, SSF Secretariat, and members of the SSF. Mr. Speaker, sir, among the various events on bridging the ocean's climate nexus, mobilizing greater finance for climate action and improved access modalities for financing with developing countries, Fiji joined the coalition of finance ministers for climate action. The coalition seeks to bring to the fore fiscal responses to combat the astronomical challenge of climate change. Fiji, together with other countries, endorsed the principles of the coalition of finance ministers for climate change, or climate action, I should say, which refers generally to the Helsinki principles, to underline the political commitment to work actively to tackle climate change nationally and collectively through macroeconomic and fiscal policies. Mr. Speaker, sir, political decision makers must quickly realize that development finance is not mutually exclusive to climate finance, and neither is climate finance exclusive from development finance. They are synonymous, as we've been saying for the past 4 years. They are indeed the same. Fiji has long recognized the fact. This is why in 2016 we thought ahead and in fact embedded climate change department or division within the Ministry of Economy to mainstream our climate change policies into a whole of government planning. And Mr. Speaker, so joining this coalition was in fact very organic for us. And we're one of the first few countries, we're in fact the first few countries in the world to actually have the Ministry of Economy having climate change within its own purview. Mr. Speaker, sir, following the briefing at Washington, or the meetings in Washington, we also participated in the 4th Annual United Nations Economic and Social Council Forum on Financing for Development, commonly known as ECOSOC, which is where the UN Secretary-General, His Excellency, was also present. Mr. Speaker, sir, we also participated in a high-level ministerial panel with the Minister for International Development Cooperation of Sweden and the Minister for Finance and Public Service of Jamaica to make the case for deploying new and innovative approaches for financing for development. The panel discussion discussed innovative approaches being deployed to address problems created by climate change. It was noted by the ministers that governments cannot do it alone, and a blended finance approach would be taken and could be taken by countries to work with development partners in the private sector to make investments go further. The Water Authority of Fiji's Rewa River Water Supply Scheme project, which will utilize a grant of US $30 million from the Green Climate Fund to leverage over US $200 million of concessional resources for the significant urban water supply project, was mentioned as an example by Fiji during the discussions. Of course, as we know, it will provide safe and continuous water supply to over 300,000 people. And within that context also, Mr. Speaker, sir, we now currently looking at the Nandi River Rehabilitation Program, and because of the fantastic amount of work and in-depth work that has been put together, working with JICA in Japan, we now already have 5 players that actually want to participate in funding this $400 million Nandi Rehabilitation Project. These now include JICA, the Japanese government, ADB, we now have the European Investment Bank, we also have, for the first time, the French Development Bank, which only funds in the French territories, is also interested in participating in this project. And of course, Mr. Speaker, sir, the Australians have announced, and I wanted to talk about this in the ADB forum, but Australians have announced a $2 billion, what they call AIFFP, Australian Infrastructure Finance Facility Program. And in that $2 billion program, they'll give loans to the tune of $1.5 billion to Pacific Island countries, and of which $500 million, in addition to that, will be by way of grant. We also, Mr. Speaker, sir, talked about the green bonds that have been listed in London Stock Exchange. One of the issues that we are actually pushing, Mr. Speaker, sir, while the green bond actually gives us a lot of publicity around it, we are more interested in the cost of the funds. So the pricing of the bonds is in fact not necessarily any different to a normal bonds that you go out into the market and issue. So you can get about 6.5%, 6.25%. There's no difference. So what we are now talking and what we've been pushing the envelope on is to ensure that when you have a green bond that's issued, that we get the pricing right, and we're talking to the development partners to see how they can actually encourage the private sector in their own countries to be able to provide a much cheaper cost of finance. And that can be done in a number of measures which we are currently talking to them about. Fiji also called the UN to deliver new consensus between the world leaders to significantly increase financial resources available to countries like Fiji, especially small developing states. And Mr. Speaker, sir, we have also seen an appetite by many of our development partners more focused on specific areas of climate change. So as we announced that we're setting up a trust fund for relocation, and those who are subjected to climate change and have to be relocated, we've already put down our guidelines, and many development partners, in fact, want to have this type of targeted financing. Mr. Speaker, sir, in the ECOSOC forum, we also stated the need for financing for development, the opening of the forum, which included addresses from the Secretary-General and the President of the Secretary-General, Fernando Espinosa. Mr. Speaker, sir, we've also made a comment, as we've said earlier on, that we now need to look at the bigger pool of funds. One of the issues that's actually facing the financing of climate change matters is that we are traditionally or conventionally restricted to organizations like World Bank, IMF, and now Green Climate Fund, and of course then trying to seek private sector participation. Fiji's suggestion is that in that matrix, we need to bring in organizations and institutions and bilateral partners, for example, the Exim banks of India, Korea, China, and various other banks, the European Investment Bank. We need to bring in various regional programs that specific countries have. For example, the Chinese have $600 billion project for the Pacific. If we're able to pool all those funds together with the World Bank, with the IMF, and ring fence it related to climate finance, then it creates a bigger aggregate pool, and which will then attract more private sector financing in the climate finance space. And this is something that is a new idea that Fiji is actually pushing at the global level. Mr. Speaker, sir, we also participated in the forum called the Green Climate Fund on Transforming Climate Ambition to Action, where the new CEO of Green Climate Fund participated in. We expect to get some traction in that respect. Last but not least, Mr. Speaker, sir, we also participated in the panel co-hosted by Fiji and Seychelles on the margins, where we talked about blue bonds and green bonds. And in fact, Seychelles talked about their experience of the issuance of blue bonds. Fiji is currently looking at issuing blue bonds also. We're in the early stages, but what we want to do is obviously do something a bit better than what Seychelles have done, but we can learn a lot from what Seychelles has done. And as highlighted earlier on, that financing in the blue economy space is not only beneficial in terms of creating sustainable livelihoods, but also the investment in the blue space means that we have a lot more carbon sequestration. The carbon sink in the ocean of mangroves and seagrasses, etc., the carbon capacity for those ecosystems to, in fact, absorb carbon is a lot greater than terrestrial forestry that we have seen. Mr. Speaker, see, all of this is actually a building block for the UN Secretary General's Climate Summit, which he actually highlighted an hour or so ago. Our participation will demonstrate action through raising of national ambition, prompting transformative changes, and generating political momentum through enhanced social and political drivers as well as youth and public engagement. Mr. Speaker, sir, this, of course, all of this feeds into the regional initiatives, and we saw the CAP 3 being hosted in Fiji on Monday and Tuesday. CAP actually stands for, Mr. Speaker, sir, Climate Action Pacific Partnership Conference that concluded on Tuesday afternoon. The Honourable Prime Minister and, of course, we had the President of Marshall Islands together being the chief guest, but we had leaders from all the other Pacific Island countries, Samoa, Nauru, Tuvalu, Cook Islands, and we are happy to also announce, as was seen in the publication of the Honourable Prime Minister, with the Prime Minister of Cook Islands, the Cook Islands will now be hosting CAP 4, and the funding for that, of course, is coming through the trust funds. Mr. Speaker, sir, following the two-day CAP conference, leaders and high-level representatives from the Pacific Small Island Developing States, or PSIDS, call for high greenhouse emitters to urgently take transformative action to decarbonize and to address the underlying causes and impacts of global climate change. Mr. Speaker, sir, Honourable Prime Minister, together with PSIDS leaders, have sounded the urgent need to increase climate ambition in an effort to transition towards a low-carbon 1.5-degree future and reaffirm their commitment to increase climate action through the Regional Pacific Nationally Determined Contributions, or the NDC hub that Fiji will be actually hosting. This is a legacy, of course, Fiji's COP23 presidency. In doing so, Mr. Speaker, sir, PC's leaders also highlighted the need for enhanced climate adaptation actions to safeguard vulnerable PCs from slow and sudden onsets of climate change. Mr. Speaker, sir, in line with Fiji's priority to reduce the cost of financing and improve the presence of IFIs in the climate space, PC's leaders also call for grant and concessional financing resources and the consideration of vulnerability as a criteria for assessing concessional financing to address the specific vulnerabilities and the unique financial and institutional capacity challenges that PCs face. Indeed, as highlighted a few days ago, that 6 of the Pacific Island countries have recently been categorized by ADB to be in high levels of debt distress. Mr. Speaker, sir, Fiji is now at a time in its history where strategic, economic and social investments today will define the degree of prosperity inherited by future generations. We must continue to forge robust strategic alliances with development partners, international financial institutions and the private sector to finance our development ambitions, as government cannot do so on its own. Mr. Speaker, sir, Fiji continues to champion climate-centric development at the regional and international front, and is highlighted by the UN Secretary General, which is critically important. We amplified our presence in the global arena through our presidency of COP23 and continue to carry the momentum of climate action and indeed climate justice. Mr. Speaker, sir, while some may say we are too insignificant to make a difference, little do they know that Fiji, a small island developing state in the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean, has already powered the waves of transformational change towards a sustainable and low-carbon future through our global leadership. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir.